holidays was a kind of tying together talk of outlining a little bit the overview of where we've been and how some of the things that I've been talking about fit together in the bigger picture of things. And I used the word nesting dolls. Happy that Tom's got a set of nesting dolls up there on the shelf. And then also the idea of fractal, that, you know, some of the, within the nesting dolls, you get in and in and in and in, and you have something that opens up and it's the whole thing. So we've got a couple of places of fractals where, you know, here on the fourth noble truth, we've got the Four Noble Truths here as, it's a fractal. The Four Noble Truths is its own set of teachings that contain virtually everything. And so we've got, in the Four Noble Truths, there's several fractals. There's the dependent origination is a fractal that contains everything. The view, it contains the Four Noble Truths, which contains everything. The eight of mindfulness contains the four foundations of mindfulness, which contains everything. So we've got these complexities that are weaving back and forth, and then we have Lumpur Dun and his gorgeous, succinct, pithy way of encapsulating the entire teachings. The mind set out is the cause of suffering. Seeing the mind set out is the path. The result, you know, that just like in 4 sentences, he just completely wraps up everything and encapsulates it in a practice path that shows us that this is not just some kind of academic, intellectual exercise, but it's a way of orienting our attention so that we can practice. So that was last class, you know, all of that. And so here we are with open space to talk about whatever is interesting. So what's interesting?
I wondered if we could talk about the 7th step there on the Eightfold Path, right concentration. And there's a lot of stuff around that, a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of things I just don't get about concentration and its place in the path. So I know that's kind of an amorphous question, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
So there's been a conversation that's gone on for thousands of years about this topic and how much concentration is needed in order to accomplish the path. And there's divergent views. Some people say that it's really important to go through the preliminary jhanas and have the mind absorb into unification as a way of purifying the mind and developing the muscles of the mind, so that when one pulls out of the jhanas and then is working with the insight, you've got the resources and the nervous system calmed down enough so that it can actually make good use of the insight. So that's one school. And the other school of thought says that that level of concentration is not necessary. All that is needed is to be able to stay with things enough to be able to see it. And that's sufficient for the path to unfold. And I think it isn't so much a question of deciding which is right and which is wrong, as it is more a question of saying, what's our path and how can we optimize it? So that's my approach, is rather than funneling everybody into a one-size-fits-all way. My approach is, what's your way, and how can we support you to develop that better? I was just talking, I'd mentioned to Tom and I just mentioned to Judy, I had some retreat time before, over the holidays. And I spent 5 days at Wilbur Hot Springs, and then I went to a friend's house. And the pain I was in was really high level pain. So it took a lot for me to develop the capacity just to be with it without the mind just kind of turning away and kind of blanking out. But when I was able to do that, sustain attention with it, then it opened up and started to unravel and then fall apart. So, but it took a lot to get there. But having got there, the relief was noteworthy, as well as the connections between all these many different things about why it was so like this, so knotted up, so solid, so much like why it was so painful. And so, but my personal path was not to push myself, but to finesse it, okay? So it was absolutely strategic and deliberate that I went to Wilbur Hot Springs for 5 days before this, as a way to, because I was tired, I was worn out, my body was depleted, as a way of bringing more nourishment and more ease and more relaxation. So it's not a push, it's a relaxation into an ability to sustain attention.
So are you saying that's an example of concentration?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And what was the pain? Physical, emotional? Or
It was
both?
everything. It was everything pain.
Yeah.
All tangled up together.
Got it.
Yeah. Yes.
And my experience with that factor, I don't particularly like the word concentration, but is that inevitably, when I practice a lot in that particular way, it converts me from doing more to allowing more. So instead of me making something happen, it just makes me kind of rest back and allow whatever's happening to happen, which is, for me, it's a big shift, right?
It is a big shift.
Everything in my life has always been, let's go get that.
Yes,
right? As opposed to like, well, I don't have to know what I'm doing here. It's just, there's some, I personally have a lot of satisfaction and when my mind gets very stable, just because, I don't know, something pleasant about it.
But it is pleasant, and it's also, it's like the best nervous system limbic injury medicine that you can get. So when the mind unifies like that, the nervous system chills out, and that's a complete medicine for any kind of agitation that's limbic related. It's the best medicine for it. But the trick is that when we're navigating limbic injury, we have everything in us that's going to obstacles to make that available to us. So concentration becomes really challenging with limbic injury, because the system is scanning, looking for everything that's wrong. It's not settled and focused and relaxing. And so to shift it into that, unification where one's just dropping in is a big reversal from that initial experience. But so from the limbic injury perspective, part of the reasons why retreats can be so challenging, even problematic, is that what ends up happening is that all of the stuff that is resistant to concentration gets stimulated rather than the conditions to support the reverse. That's why it's like you know, what Renee was talking about on that retreat, where they set up the structure of the retreat that allowed contact. It meant that people could soothe and feel the nourishment that they needed so that they could then move in and out of silence and contact, so that then people could get a lot out of the meditation. It wasn't like the only option was to be silent. And so that's, I'm sure part of the reason why that retreat was so hugely successful was you've got a demographic of a people with a high concentration of trauma and limbic injury, and yet they had the intelligence as teachers to figure out how to navigate that, to allow an easeful rather than a pressurized or shaming way of dealing with that. Like, I had this like dream of like creating a retreat center that's got a, you know, connection space in it, you know, with waterfalls, sounds, and reclining chairs, and people can either be quiet or you know, have kind of inquiry questions with each other in a way that just feels soft and nourishing, where that's built into the retreat center. It's not like it's a weird thing, it's just like available, you know. What word do you use instead of concentration?
I like collection of mind, or just kind of this emphasizing that the distractions sort of fall away, and you eventually, I mean, I know like there are experiences which I don't think are meditative, but like when you're doing something, like even certain types of work, or maybe when you're doing mathematics, or maybe when you're playing a musical instrument, you can become, or when you're having a good, difficult physical like run, you're so completely, you kind of sense this because you're so completely absorbed in that activity that a lot of the other stuff falls away. So it has a lot of attributes of this kind of almost everyday experience for me, but it's I don't know how to describe it. Once, for me, I got there by just breathing at the Anapana spot for 2 or 3 weeks, you know, and that's all I was completely intent in just doing that. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, and it's just it's unlike any experience I've had before where I didn't need it to add anything. It was just like, I guess I needed to be breathing, you know, and occasionally be hungry or have to go to the bathroom, but it was completely enough, and it was a really eye opener for me to, wow, really? And this is available all the time, you know. So it's not that I don't forget that sometimes, but you know, lots of times I'm walking around like at work, and I just start reading here just to try to kind of remind myself to collect myself a little bit, and it's nice, you know. I think the Buddha even said there's nothing negative about that type of pleasure.
That's right, it's completely blameless pleasure.
Yeah.
Completely blameless pleasure.
And when you hear some of the quotes that he says about this, like the mind is bright, malleable, and fit for work. So you understand, I have a little sense of what, I mean, I never got to these levels of absorption that he was into, but I don't think in fact, I never think I've been in jhana, but for me just to have this experience in life where it was entirely enough for me just to do that, it's like, wow. You know, it's like,
Who was that you were referring to?
that quotation?
Yeah.
The Buddha said that.
Oh, Buddha. Oh.
It depends, I mean, you have to sift your way through this. You have not to be biased against those sorts of practices, but
It sounded like a flow experience. You know, the definition of flow is.
Flow, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, where all those distractions just fall away, like you're saying. You know, you're focused and at ease.
I have no interest in understanding it cognitively. I mean, that's like one of the few things in my life that I don't want to kind of like take apart cognitively. It's just like, I don't know, it just sort of works. It's like all these people want to have physiological measures that meditation works. So this sort of experience I had with this absorption, I don't care if anybody else thinks it's true or not. It just so deeply resonant.
But you see, that's the thing about confidence. There's faith, and there's right faith, and there's this kind of faith, which is the faith of like, you know, you taste the You taste the apple pie, you taste the berry pie, you know how sweet it is. You don't need anybody to, doesn't matter what anybody's opinion is about it.
What the blood chemistry says, what the.
Right.
Right, it's just like, I have got this, and you can have whatever opinion you want. It's a different, and that's what confidence is. It's, you don't need, what anybody else in the whole world thinks will not have an impact on the fact that you've tasted it and you know yourself,
I sometimes think this is what is the type of feeling that deep experiential knowledge is all about.
That's
I've
right.
never seen any sign of the 3 universal characteristics that I'm aware of, but when they talk about this being a felt experience, this is very much what this sort of absorption thing was for me. This was very much a felt experience that I had no idea it was out there. I had no idea I was heading towards it, but it just sort of happened. So, but I won't say
Yes.
anymore.
Terry.
So I'm just sort of ingesting what you've said about the experience, and then your I guess your fantasy retreat place and some of the issues that I think a lot of us have felt in silent retreat. So maybe this is more of a Saturday question than it is a Wednesday question, but it's like, so where can we go to get all the good reinforcement that we need to develop the confidence to not feel like we're fighting upstream, to get where we need to go? If retreats aren't it, I mean, what's out there? Are there resources that perhaps we're not aware of or that have worked for people? I don't know.
I mean, it's a brilliant question, and I think that's part of the reason why, I have been wanting to, evolve a new model. That's been my dream. That's been my passion. And, I've just had this long string of things that I've been having to navigate that has been part of the reason why it's both my passion as well as the challenges for me to actually roll it out. Because I see very distinctly that there's 2 things that we're navigating, and they are intertwined and they are separate. They're both intertwined and separate. And so the one thing that is brilliant about the Buddha's teachings is that it pokes, it shines, it illuminates the layers of ignorance that keep us from seeing the natural, original, clear, luminous presence of the mind's ability to know itself, okay? So part of what we're doing is we're peeling away, so that we can rest in that. But the other thing that we're doing is this tender process, which is not, it's the opposite of fierce, it's incredibly tender, of touching the places where there wasn't sufficient holding, where there's developmental fractures or ruptures, where there's attachment wounding, where there's limbic injury, where there's trauma. And this is not about pressure, fierceness, or pushing. This is about holding and seeing and attuning and developing the ground from which a healing can emerge. And depending on what you're dealing with, whether it's limbic injury, attachment wounding, trauma, there are specific tools and technologies to use to help heal those things. Where these dovetail is that when there's a certain amount of limbic injury, trauma, or attachment wounding that's operating in the system, we don't have the relaxed attention that we need in order to peel back the layers to be able to see clearly. And as we get closer to peeling back the layers to be able to see clearly, rather than that activate the natural release, it activates like the shit terrifying terror that feels like blood curdling abandonment, of like dropping into a pit of absolute nothingness, because rather than moving into the experience of emptiness, we are moving into the primary wounding of our attachment injury. So the emptiness that the insight evokes is catalyzing the attachment wounding injury to get completely agitated. And it's extremely rare that a meditation teacher that understands emptiness can recognize what's happening and offer the kind of gentle, loving holding to redirect and to get this thing back on track. So what I would love, what I fantasize or start to like wonder about, is what would it look like to have a culture of meditation teachers where this was common knowledge rather than the unbelievably, exceptionally rare phenomena, that the teachers understood both of these things and were able to help the students when this kind of stuff happened. So there are technologies for limbic injury, there are technologies for attachment repair, there are technologies for trauma. And I've been learning some of them for myself and also developing a little bit more capacity to discern for what's helpful for my students. So when I go to a classical place and I say, the Buddhist meditation is not enough, the other teachers say, this is shocking. I've never heard anybody say this before.
It seems to me, though, that Temple has some understanding of this. And this is...
I think that there's an increasing, I don't know what the right word is, but I think more people are coming to an understanding that about some of this stuff. I don't think it's quite as rare as it has been, but it's still not mainstream enough where when a person is on a retreat and the teachings and the insight is activating their attachment wounding and they're recoiling into the fear experience of that the teachers actually understand what's happening and are corrective in their advice. So whether it's a Wednesday question or a Saturday question, I think it's a big question. Mm-hmm. And it is a big question, and I have a question, for this group, is that if we were to shift gears from, like our little whatever we're doing, to like what would we want, like collectively, if we could dream this together, what would we want? What would we want to create? What would be a response to the situation that we find ourselves in? Which is that we don't have a retreat center where this is common knowledge and commonly practiced. We don't have teachers for whom this is just automatically known. So if we had magic wands, what would we want to create? What would it look like? What would be something that would be so profoundly nourishing that your system wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have to be swimming upstream? It's like going to Wilbur Hot Springs and it's like, oh, this is the perfect temperature water. Mm-hmm. It's just like, oh, this is perfect. What would that look like?
It would change.
could only be perfect in that moment.
Mm.
But you see, the thing at Wilbur is that there's 4 different temperature tubs.
But
So
it-
you'd have to move to another tub.
Yes, but they've got the 4 tubs, they're all right there. So it's not like you have to make a big trip. You just get out of one and into the other one.
And
And-
probably you want a spot where, like I've heard you and other people in the group say that nature's a good pathway to nourishment, so you have to have
Yes.
them. It can't be in an urban center probably, it probably has to be a place where you can get out into nature
Right.
somehow. I mean, not such Japanese style nature or something, but it needs to have something.
But you know, when we've been at Robbie's house, you know, the garden there is just glorious. It doesn't have to be like an enormous, like 500,000 acres. But when you have a garden that's well constructed like that, your nervous system relaxes. But I would agree.
Yeah.
That would be on my list. Nature.
You know, one time I was on a retreat where it was I won't tell you, well, I can tell you, but there was no place for people to stay where the retreat center was. So people had to have different carpools that they came in. And our carpool made the agreement that it was like a 45-minute drive each way, that once we left the retreat center for the day, we would break silence. And we had a meal together. And we even had a bottle of wine together. And it was just such a, yeah, I know, it was like a heresy, right? But it made such a rich experience for all of us, and we all felt deeply connected to each other. And I'm sure the practice was better the next day because we were like refreshed, renewed, reinvigorated, and
So what you were doing was you were evaluating or you were appreciating the relational cohesiveness and developing it. And the result of developing relational cohesiveness is that it allowed you to get more out of the meditation, which is exactly my point. That there's a way in which what we need to do is develop a field of relational cohesiveness as a support in being able to relax and do this work. So there's different things that are needed. One thing that's needed is to understand this stuff and how it works and what are the meditation applications for it. Another thing that's needed is to understand some of the places where we're wounded and the technologies that support repair. And another thing that's needed is how do you develop a cohesive relational field so that our nervous systems relax and we feel like we belong. We don't feel like we are the weird, odd one out. Which is what happens to people who are traumatized, what happens to queer people, what happens to trans people, what happens to people who somehow feel that they are different because their self-regulating mechanism is not vibrating with other people that they are in contact with. But when you create a cohesive relational field, then what you get is this vibrating of resonance, and odd one out falls away. It feels like, oh, I belong here. Yes.
I would appreciate in this dream environment a place to move that there's freedom in it. Like if you go on retreat, they might offer Qigong or yoga, but there's really no place where you can go and dance freely or move freely that's comfortable and that you can do relationally, non-verbally, and I would feel held in that environment, and that would support my practice.
That's possible. I've been to 2 retreats that did just that, you know, where they had Qigong and yoga and things like that in between the meditations.
I
All
don't
done
want,
in silence, but it was, you know, it was an adjunct to it.
right, but that's someone else's system of movement. I
No.
want a place where I can express my own movement.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Because I can't that's, like I say, that's not, doesn't come from inside, that's outside in,
Outside.
and I chafe at that. It doesn't suit my, that's not my natural movement.
Right, so you need a different temperature tub.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you probably have the skill set to know that, oh, I need to change from like sitting, I need to go move or something like that. And
That's
that's
right.
probably enriches your ability to practice because
Yeah.
you're not just,
That's very true. And it's hard in the structured setting of like Spirit Rock. You know, you'd be disturbing somebody, you know, if you walk too fast, you're sort of disturbing somebody, you know, and you have to go off somewhere and then you feel other because.
But I think, I mean, I did a day-long retreat with Melanie DeMoore. Melanie is a completely awesome human being in many, many different ways. But, you know, and she uses music as her ministry, you know, but she also gets people moving, which is not the same as what you're talking about. But what was happening, I think, is that because we were weaving back and forth between a very rich relational field that included music and movement and silence and meditation, then the result of that was just that people came out of that with reviews that was like, you know, they'd been coming to Spirit Rock for 25 years and this is the best, the results of this retreat were more effective than anything else that they'd ever been to, you know, because it encompassed much more of the human experience.
Yes.
And that's, personally, that's what I would love to find a way, is to do things like that day-long retreat over 5 days, over 10 days, you know, to have that kind of rich relational field that moves between these components and touches the deep meditation stuff, but also includes this deep relational sense of trusting and caring about each other.
I just keep looking at the chart because I think this whole Eightfold Noble Path is like really important. It's kind of like the key to everything, and maybe what we're looking at. I guess I'm starting to think a retreat is not the end all be all. It's kind of like where we get some insights of wisdom, but it's what we take home and how we apply it. That really is the Eightfold Noble Path, right? So then maybe it's a combination of what we learn in retreat, however imperfect or perfect, but what is it, do we have that support when we get home? That seems to be the big key, and maybe...
So that's also part of it, because, you know, this whole Vipassana scene is based on, you know, once a week meditation retreats, or once a week Dharma talks, or these immersive, intense retreat things, but they leave and then there's no follow-up.
Right.
So that there is no real relational field building in that sense, where people, the model does not include that as part of what's really important. Of how do you sustain connections with the Sangha outside of the specific times when you meet, in a way where that actually deepens.
Yeah, and I kind of would be curious if folks do have that. Do people have sort of like a little support? I can't remember what it's called. KM?
Kalyanamita.
Kalyanamita?
Yep.
Do folks do that? Does it help?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually in three Kalyanamita groups.
Oh, are they? They're separate.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, one is completely independent of James Perez's Sangha. Another, I met there at the Sangha. And then actually we have our DPP one, you know. So yeah. And each one, it's like they're different levels of intimacy and connection, and they've been going on for different amounts of time, but the Kalyan Namitta is a wonderful idea. And there was a time where many groups started. And then what happened is this is my analysis of it, because I worked as a dedicated volunteer for Spirit Rock, developing the Kalyan Namitta program for a certain number of years. So then certain people, their groups became set, and actually they were no longer accepting new members because the relationships had developed, and they just didn't want to absorb any else because there was just too much history that had gone on. And so sometimes I get somebody will, have kept my contact information and say they would really like to wonder, like my group says that it's closed, but they were wondering could they get on a waiting list. But I talked to the people and I said, we just don't want to go there. So it's then I talked to somebody who just started a group from James Asanga, and even he was reluctant to take a new member. Now Melanie, do you know Melanie Spear? Melanie has been part of our
In a different number.
Yes.
intensive, and Melanie she started a group, and she has a group that I think she is actually working along with a couple of groups, and
We have
so
a KM group.
you do, and
3 of us are here.
that's right.
We have 5.
Mhm.
And it would be nice to have an additional
Have a group.
special person. Yeah.
I was curious, I have a group too, I mean, we've
Oh, well,
been
okay.
together for 20 years,
There
actually.
you go.
But,
Okay.
and I was
Ours is
thinking
different.
about that, it sustains, but we're not, well, anyway, it's got a long and complicated history, but, yeah, I mean, because so much of it is beyond a retreat,
Mhm.
right? It's so
Yes,
much.
yeah.
But I don't know, I feel like if it weren't for these various groups, it would be very difficult to go it alone. And I was just curious about what other people.
Is there a leader in this, or a facilitator or something in these groups?
Sometimes the original idea was that there would be, but most of we're all sort of self-regulating now.
Mm.
So, but it's a different thing when groups start out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd think it needs some direction of some sort, or focus, or I don't know what, because it seems so easy for us to get distracted, and once we're getting out of silence, get into the world.
When you get back in the world.
If you're interested in starting one, look on the Spirit Rock website. I would imagine that all of the information about it is still there.
Really,
I haven't
I've
checked
never heard
recently.
of this before, so thank you.
Uh-huh.
I'm learning something really new here.
Yes, Michael.
I've had a couple other experiences that have deeply connected me to other Buddhists, but it's not directly on Buddhist topics. Well, one was, about 10 of us from my community in Sacramento done a Buddhist pilgrimage to India and did the usual holy circuit. And I'm still really closely bonded to 3 or 4 people from that group, just from that shared experience. And sometimes we'll talk about practice, but it's somehow that we have that connection. So I guess that's like a relational field. Like I feel nourished when I'm around those people. And then for about 10 years, I was leading sitting groups in the new Folsom Prison, the level 4 facility, and that also was about Buddhism because we're leading meditation groups, but kind of collectively eating the shit of working our way through the prison system, really closely bonded a lot of us together, and we still talk about practice and all that stuff when I see these people. So maybe it's not quite as direct as what you're talking about, but it still makes me feel like I'm not by myself. I had a big falling out with one of these people, and I know I have this lifelong connection to this person, but we can't quite bridge that gap yet. But I just know I'm still very connected to her, right? And I just haven't quite figured out how we're going to reconnect again. So I value that connection. So I guess that's supportive of my practice. I mean, I can, because if you know people like for 10 or 15 years like that, all of a sudden you know that they've been practicing for 10 or 15 years. So.
you know, anybody who manages to survive India together, you know, it's like, I mean, there's two kinds of world travelers. There's world travelers and there's world travelers who've been to India, and they are not the same. And so, you know, it's just such an unbelievably intense place of paradox and contradictions and ironies, and you know, Bodh Gaya, you know, the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, is one of the poorest places of India. And you have right in the middle of this, the field of the Buddha's awakened mind, you have some of the most desperately poor people that you will have ever seen, and it's right in the same spot. So to navigate that, you know, it's like, wow, of course there's going to be a bonding. So when you go through intense things with people, then it kind of cuts across the dross, cuts through the dross, and it's like it's the same with prison. Prison is a really bullshit-free zone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people who are in prison, they don't have any energy for bullshit. You know, they just don't. And so when you hang out with people who are in prison, or hang out with other people who are facilitating stuff going on in prison, it's like you've gone through a certain kind of purification fire, because the bullshit-free zone has been cleared away. And that is bonding. So when we're living in ordinary times, which we no longer are, you know, none of us are living in ordinary times anymore. But in ordinary times, it's easier to get the dross accumulate and to get sidetracked into eddies. But when you go through these intense things that are so purifying because they're so extreme, then some of that dross clears away, and then what's left is just elemental. And that elemental place is a place where it's much easier to connect. It's like backpacking with somebody, you know, where it's simple, but it's intense. When you backpack with somebody, you're bonded. You just are.
Yeah.
You don't even need to like them very much. You're still bonded.
Yeah.
You know.
It's kind of like the experience is so tense that you don't have any habitual patterns for dealing with that, so you have to kind of be present for what's going on because you've never been in that experience before.
Yes, and India, like India in particular, it's like there's only two options. You completely crack up or let go. There's no gray. You know?
But just to get back to the Eightfold Path thing, I think this is a helpful conversation because it sounds like there has to be some sort of connection with your group, whether it's a KM group or another kind of group. But there has to be some sort of almost unconditional holding, right? Because as you move from pool to pool, the different heat of the pool, you have some place to land where there's going to be that level of support. And it seems like there's a certain trial by fire, whether it's through prison, whether it's through DPP, whether it's, some other, there's a common shared experience that where people will take you for who you are and help you with your path.
Right.
That's what I'm hearing.
At we were talking about possible ideas or different things for another intensive. And one of the ideas that I put forward was to focus on the relational field as a topic for the intensive. So, I mean, certainly we would do some kind of a Buddhist something or another, but the main thing would be actually to develop the relational field. Because my experience is that after a certain critical mass where there is a relational field, it's a little bit like being in a slippery slope waterfall. There's just a sense of gliding, of ease. Now, to get to that point is not easy. So living in the monastery with the nuns, it was heavy lifting because we were in this complicated dynamic with the monks. And so it took a lot of effort for us to get to that place where our relational field was coherent. But when it was, it had an enormous impact on I experienced it myself. And so I that is not something that is like, it's not something that I've heard people speak about. Certainly they speak about Kalyanamita groups, but I haven't heard people talk about like there's a fabric of relatedness after which a certain point there's some kind of thing that happens in the group where people feel differently about the level of support that's available in the Sangha.
Just a quick one. One of the, I think, key components to a Kalyanamitra group, or probably, it's that there's a sila component to it, that it's like wise speech, right speech, confidentiality, things like that are a bedrock. You can't have feel safe in your relational field unless that's built in as a foundation. And there has to be the sense that what you say within your group stays in your group, and that you're not going to be chit-chatting about it in the aisle of the supermarket.
Absolutely. So there's different things, and one of them is sila, and the other is presence. That when people are present with each other, they're just really present. And so this quality of being witnessed and seen is part of the quickening that happens when the relational field gets developed to a certain point. Is that the act of being witnessed and seen is like a synergistic effect to your own ability to witness and see. It's like it's magnified or potentized, and as a result there's more insight, and there's also sometimes shifts that happen faster than you would normally expect. So what I'm hearing, these different components, one component is a component that allows for silence and depth and traditional meditation. One is a component that allows for movement and nature, and one is one that actually has some intelligence around developing a relational field that has integrity and presence and some level of accountability.
And unconditionality, I would add. No matter how flawed you are, they're going to love you.
So what about something like a building project on a retreat, like a trail building project or something? It sounds maybe too contrived. But what if there was like a bicycle trip you did over hills for like one part of a day trip? So it wasn't really clear that everybody was going to make it, but the whole group tried to do that together. I don't know if that would be kind of something like that would be somehow bonding and physically.
Well, yeah. There could be a million different things, that people do. Certainly one of the things, there could be projects, there can be charity work, there can be
Habitat for Humanity.
There can be building things, building nature things. There's a million different ways of doing it. I think the what's needed is to have the sense that it's worthwhile trying to do. So I was just talking with, do you know the hugging mother?
Amma.
The big Amma.
The big Amma.
The Indian Amma.
The Indian Amma.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, her organization has like 15 different charitable organizations that it operates.
Oh, wow.
And they span women's issues, housing, food, environmental sustainability.
Health. They have hospitals, health stuff.
Health stuff, hospitals, So that's 7 out of like 15. And so they've got their practice, they've got their devotion, and they spend a lot of time raising funds and engaging in charitable acts. And so that organization pulls it together that way. But I think, it could be all kinds of stuff,
So thinking about this another way, thinking like say Spirit Rock is trying to kind of be a little piece of a monastery that's kind of been torn off. But maybe what you're talking about is taking part of our regular lives and tearing it off and making it something more intentional, right? So instead of us being pretend monks and nuns for a week at a time, we pretend to be somehow more engaged regular people. I mean, this is kind of what you're talking about, right? This is the world we're in. I mean, it might sound cool to be in a monastery, but most of us are not going to spend any time in a real monastery, so.
But, if you look at a real monastery, the monasteries that I lived in, we were not on retreat all the time. We worked a lot. And, we did all kinds of stuff, and some of it was very bonding together. So we would have these retreats, or we would stay up until weird hours of the morning, and we would do chanting stuff, and we would go on Bindabat together. So there was the whole culture that had us. It wasn't just that we were in silence, there was a lot of relational stuff that we did. But the monastery was also had this, a lot of people who were in the monastery had limbic injuries and trauma stuff. And it just took a while for people to figure out what was a wise way of responding to that. And some unfortunate things happened in the meantime, in terms of unskillful things happened, but had unfortunate consequences, So it's not about, it's not about creating an idealized place where we can all live, but it's about potentizing what we are doing in a way that feels nourishing and more supportive and more conducive for this path. So that's a good way of describing it. Yeah.
So, can I ask one more question about this table? What I was very confused by with the hindrances. Didn't
Yes,
you have
please.
this one of the universal solutions for the hindrances was this was it the relational field that was in that table? But let's see, I remember a column and every entry was relational field, and I had a very hard time relating to that on that Wednesday night. But I guess you're fleshing that out here this way, right?
That's right. So wise association with friends was the only consistent thing as an antidote to every single one of the hindrances. It was the only one thing that was the same for all of them. Yeah.
Well, I had no basis of understanding that one. I believe that the person believed that was true, but for me, it's.
I always think that that's just pointing again towards the importance of connection. And all that you're talking about here, this relational field is about connection, it seems like.
Completely. That's right.
Yeah, and that's one of the major tenets of all of this, right?
That's right, but you see, the connection, the connection that they talk about in Buddhist philosophy is not the relational field so much as the causes and conditions that give rise. They're talking about it in a these things do connect, but that's not what they're speaking about. They're not talking about the relational connection. They're talking about the way that so many individual parts are connected in order to bring about a different result.
I took it to mean the former, that it was about relational connection.
No, which is part of the reason why these retreat centers and the monasteries are the way that they are, because they don't always have the relational field that's necessary in order to do this work. So you could, Ajahn Pasano is the abbot of Abhayagiri, and I've known him since 1987 or so. He's an excellent monk, really excellent monk. He understands about a relational field for monks, okay? And so his community, that community at Abhayagiri is one of the most successful monastic training monasteries in the Western world. And it's because he's a good monk and because he understands a relational field. and they live in a, in a conducive property on the forest and all the rest. I mean, there's many factors that go into it, but those are a few of the factors that I would say really support why it is as successful as it is. And it isn't an automatic thing that if you are good at meditation, you understand relational fields.
Mhm.
You know?
Mm.
Right.
And now I see how I've misinterpreted what connection really means, but I have a felt sense for connection, how important it is. For example, on this vacation that we took on Vancouver Island, my wife and I were alone a lot of the time, even though there's a lot of people around, but we never really connected with people. It seemed like we're just going from place to place. But when we got to the places where our friends live, in Washington and Oregon, that was transformative. I just immediately felt this real connection to them, and it was so nourishing. It was probably, some ways, the best part of the trip.
So it's interesting. So, okay, in the Buddhist canon, there's the suttas, the discourses, there's the vinaya, or the codes of conduct, or the threads of integrity, and then there's the abhidhamma, which is the conditionality about the different pieces and parts that make things up. But the abhidhamma is not about the relational field. Okay? So the whole thing about abhidhamma is not relational field, it's the causes and the conditions that make up certain things. Okay? So that's abstract and it's not relational. But then if you go to the Buddha, the Buddha's chief disciple was Ananda. And Ananda came to the Buddha and said, Buddha, I get it, I really get it, that wise friends is half of this whole practice. And the Buddha said, no, Ananda, it's not half, it's the whole. It's the whole of the practice. You can't actually do this without having wise friends. Okay? So he said it, but then you have these monasteries where that's not lived. You've got these retreat centers where, you have 10 minutes of interview with the teacher one every 3 days, and you're in silence, and you're not supposed to look at each other or talk to each other, and they don't set up a relational field before you get into silence. So the experience is of not of holding, it's of the opposite. So in a monastery situation, after however long it took us to establish a relational field of some holding, I felt like my sisters had my back, that they were looking after me, so that it wasn't as if I came into a space of like I didn't know anybody. We would go from our living routines to our meditative routines alternatingly. But when I was on my meditative retreats, I felt held by the community around me. This model, which is that you don't have people living in a monastery, but they show up on a retreat. They don't know each other. They go into silence. They stay in silence until the last 3 hours or day before. They come out. It's like it's a different. It's different.
I thought that, I always think it's a more specific reason for doing that, which is to really break us away from our distractions. This just minute by minute distractions that we live in the world. And I could see the real importance of that. But you're right, it's limited in some ways.
So it's true, because when we speak, all of our habits and all of our self-identities and all of our cultural conditioning also comes up. And so it's a mixed bag of tricks. It actually takes a lot to learn how to speak where we're dropped in and present, and we're not just revisiting all of these conditioning that is the stuff that we're trying to witness and move beyond. So yes, and the and is that our relationships with each other and our ability to be seen and witnessed and to witness and see is part of what helps us see the conditioning and move past it. And so I think we've talked about this before, you know, this whole path was set up in India 2,600 years ago. There wasn't something called a broken relational field there. That people were embedded in relational fields that were coherent and intact, so much so that people didn't have any relief to actually know what was arising independent of this cohesive relational field that they were part of. And so this whole meditation path and practice came from a cultural situation that was very different from the one that we're in now. And so part of the magic wand is, okay, given what we're dealing with now, what is a wise and compassionate response to support waking up? Yes, please.
You know, it's interesting, one of the most poignantly sad parts of trauma is the lack of belonging. That is really something that's taken away. I don't know exactly how that happens, but people who have experienced trauma don't feel that they belong into the human race. That they don't belong, and it's and so in the retreat environment, where you actually don't belong, there's nobody there that knows you. There's nobody there who understands this, how emptiness triggers this fall into the abyss of abandonment. It's very painful.
It's excruciating and painful. Yeah.
So
And
this idea of belonging seems to me somehow, right now, for me, to be a key
yes,
element.
that's right. And that's the place, like, that's not fierce. That's tender and
Yeah.
kind and gentle and, and just ease. That's the right temperature of the water. It's just like to go at the speed of trust, to move at the speed of trust. Yeah. Yeah. And what it takes to do that, so for me it seems like, we would be wise to spend a couple days and dance and have parties and dinners and a glass of wine and dig in the garden, and then switch gears, and then spend more time meditating, and then come out periodically and dance and dig in the garden, and then, so that what we're doing is we're staying connected to our valuing of each other.
And our humanness.
And our humanness, and our bodies, and our ability to give and to serve and to play as a way of holding this work that needs to be held.
Yeah, there's a kind of oscillation there, a kind of rhythm.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And that the more, because it's like, the to move at the speed of trust. And as the field becomes more coherent, it will have more capacity for more silence and more experiences of emptiness without this crashing back into the experience of abandonment.
This is what the communes of the 60s and 70s
Tried.
ideally
Tried,
really
yeah.
tried to do. They garden together, they dance together.
Yeah, they didn't have much of a moral framework, though.
I'm not saying that there were some that They were trying that. I mean, yeah,
Well, there is the one in Kentucky, I guess it is.
yes,
It's
yes.
still going, actually.
right, yeah, I'll vouch for that.
The farm, yeah.
But don't you think that, like on a silent retreat, after, I don't know, like a week or 5 days even, it kind of shows your craving for a relational feel, because you start building connections with the people who sit next to you, even though you know nothing about them other than how they sit and how quiet they are when they sit down, but you're still trying to, that connection sometimes just seems so special at the end of a retreat. I don't know anything about this person, I don't maybe how they smell and how they sound, but it's like you want that connection and there's nothing else available, so you start building it somehow, right?
Well, there is
I don't know
that.
if you agree with that.
You're physically next to them.
Well, I mean, we're relational beings, and so it's like we will do that whether we're in silence or we're not
That's
in
right.
It's like we're potatoes in the bin in the dark, we still start growing up roots to try to get nourishment.
Put out those buds.
Well, we're nearly at our pumpkin hour. Maybe we can switch gears, and just rich conversation, and just take a moment and noticing just what's alive and what's present in your body, and in your heart, and in your mind. And maybe what we can do is we can just go in a circle. Somebody can start, and we can just move in a circle and take just a couple of words as a word necklace to just name a mood in the body, a feeling in the heart, and an impression in the mind. Would somebody like to begin? Yeah.
How about tenderness and expansive?
And then Terry?
Quiet.
Tiredness, but connected.
Tom?
Full and curious. This has been very illuminating meeting.
Wanting to belong.
And Judy?
Tired and relieved.
Comfort.
And full and glad. Gay?
No, I've already gone.
Taya,
Taya.
sorry.
Interested, curious.
Happy. Good. And so now just these last minutes, just bring to mind the goodness of our gathering here together, the impact, and expressing, allowing the appreciation of that to flow to Tom and to Chris for welcoming us in their home, and to each other for showing up and engaging in this rich conversation, to the teachers and the teachings that hold this space. To our friends who are not here with us tonight. And just recognizing that we're in the middle of this wonderful, rich, unfolding process, and allowing the blessings of this to spread out and touch our family members and our friends and our other sanghas and communities. To move into the earth and the air and the water. Fill up the rocks and the living beings that we don't know, so that all beings everywhere can feel the blessings of our work, our practice, our presence, our heartfulness. Our inquiry, our release, our struggles, and our love.